If you listen close enough, you can still hear it. It comes to you sometimes in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, when you weren't expecting anything. The screen door swings open somewhere in the back of your memory, and suddenly you are standing in a churchyard in the American South, and the air smells like gardenias and pressed hair, and somebody brought in a covered dish from 3 miles down the road, and the women are all wearing white gloves, and the men have on their best, and somewhere close by there is a sound. Not music exactly, not yet. More like the sound of people who have been waiting for something beautiful for a very long time, and it has finally arrived. A wedding was coming. Now you have to understand what that meant. Not what it means now, with the venues and the planners and the hashtags. What it meant then. In a black community in the Jim Crow South, in the years between 1930 and 1965, a wedding was not just a ceremony between two people. It was a declaration. It was a whole community standing up together and saying, "We are still here, we are still building, we are still capable of joy, not in spite of what the world was doing to us." Right in the middle of it. They couldn't always vote. They couldn't always eat at a counter or walk through the front door. But they could stand in the sight of God and join two of their own together, and they could do it with a beauty and a ceremony and a dignity that nobody on earth could take from them. And what they built around that moment, the traditions, the rituals, the customs passed from one generation to the next. Family. That is what we are here to remember today. Hey family, I'm James. And today, we are going all the way back to the Jim Crow South, to the churchyards and the front parlors and the red clay roads, to remember 30 wedding traditions that the black community carried on their backs through some of the hardest years this country has ever seen. These are traditions rooted in Africa, in slavery, in faith, in pure, stubborn love, and most of them are gone now. Gone so completely that even the grandchildren of the people who practiced them have never heard their names. Before we get into it, if you are new here, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. This channel is for folks who remember and folks who want to remember. We are building something real here, family. Hit subscribe, ring that bell, and let's go back together. Number 1. The first thing you need to know about a black wedding in the Jim Crow South is that it began long before the wedding day. It began with the asking, and I don't mean the man asking the woman. I mean the man asking the family, not just the father, the family. You went to the house. You sat down. You did not mumble. You looked the elders in the eye and you stated your intentions and your capacity to provide, and you waited. This was not a formality. This was an interview. And if you didn't pass, child, you knew it. A man who wanted to marry a woman in those communities understood that he was not just taking a wife. He was entering a covenant with her people, and her people had the right to know who they were letting in. Back in those days, the family's blessing wasn't optional. It was the first tradition. Everything else that followed rested on whether that conversation went right. Number 2. Once the blessing was given, the women took over. The announcement, what they called the publishing of the banns, was made at church, not on a piece of paper, not on a card in the mail, at church, out loud, by the pastor, from the pulpit. For 3 consecutive Sundays. The whole congregation heard it. And that was intentional, because the community was your witness. The community was your accountability. If anyone knew a reason the union should not proceed, a prior commitment, an unresolved matter of character, they had 3 Sundays to say so. That public announcement was not ceremony. It was protection, for the woman especially. You won't see that today. Number 3, the quilt. Now this one goes back further than most people realize. In the months before a wedding, the women of the church and the neighborhood would gather, usually on a Tuesday or a Wednesday evening, when the men were at lodge or choir practice, and they would make a quilt for the couple. But not just any quilt. Every woman brought a square of fabric from something that mattered. A piece of her own mother's Sunday dress, a square from a child's outgrown coat, a strip from the curtains that hung in her front window when she first set up her own house. And those pieces were stitched together by hand into something that would cover the marriage bed. It was warmth, yes. But it was also a map. Every square was somebody's life, somebody's history, laid over the couple like a blessing they would sleep under every night. Number 4. The trousseau. The bride's mother and grandmother began collecting for it years before there was even a suitor in the picture. Linens, towels, a set of dishes, purchased one piece at a time when there was a little extra at the end of a hard week. A cast-iron pot, embroidered pillowcases. These things were gathered and stored, often in a cedar chest at the foot of the mother's bed, and when the time came, the chest was opened, and the daughter received what her mother had been quietly saving for her since she was a little girl. It was how a poor family gave a daughter everything. Not all at once. A little at a time. Over years. With love so patient it doesn't even have a name in our language anymore. Number 5. The ring itself. Now I want you to hear this carefully, family. In the Jim Crow South, many of those wedding rings were not bought in a store. They couldn't afford a store. They were made. A man would take a piece of metal, sometimes silver, sometimes a coin worn smooth by years in somebody's pocket. And he would find a man in the community who knew how to work metal, a blacksmith or a tinsmith. Sometimes just a man with the right tools and the right hands, and he would have that ring shaped and fitted, and it would not look like what you see in a jewelry window. But it was real. It was labor. It was the physical shape of a promise. And that woman wore it until the day she died. And when she was gone, sometimes, her daughter wore it too. Number 6. The wedding dress was not purchased. It was sewn. And in most cases it was not sewn by a seamstress hired for the occasion. It was sewn by the women of the family, over weeks, by lamplight and window light, with whatever good fabric could be found or ordered from a catalogue, white if they could manage it, cream or ivory if not. And what those women could do with a bolt of cloth and a steady hand, the tucking, the gathering, the lace trim they tatted themselves along the collar and cuffs. Family, it was art. It was art made by women who had never had a lesson, made from love so specific it could fit one person and one person only. That dress was a masterwork. And when the wedding was over, it was packed away carefully, pressed and wrapped in muslin, for the daughter who would come after. Number 7. The night before the wedding, the women gathered in the bride's home for what they called a sitting up. It was not a party in any modern sense. There was food, yes, somebody always brought something. But the purpose was older than that. The older women sat with the young woman and they talked. They told her what marriage was, what a man needed, what to hold on to and what to let go of, what her grandmother had said to her mother on this same night years before. The accumulated wisdom of women who had made it work in hard circumstances was poured out that night, quietly, with no men present, over sweet potato pie and chicory coffee, and the young woman received it. That was the real ceremony. Everything the next day was just the public performance of a private truth. Number 8. The morning of the wedding, the bride's hair was done by the women of the family. Not a professional, not a salon. Family. Her mother, her aunts, her older sisters and cousins. They pressed and curled and pinned, and they worked slowly, deliberately, because there was no rushing this. And as they worked, they talked. Or they were quiet together. Both were a kind of holiness. The bride sat in the chair and was tended to by her people. And that tenderness, the hands of the women who had known her all her life, working gently around her face, was something she would remember when she was old and they were gone. That, sitting in the chair. Those hands. Number 9. Flowers were gathered, not bought. The bridal bouquet in a Jim Crow South wedding was almost never purchased from a florist. It was cut from gardens, from the yard of the bride's mother, from the church grounds, from the property of neighbors who offered what they had. Gardenias were favored because the smell was overwhelming and it carried. Magnolia blossoms if the season was right. Crepe myrtle. Wild honeysuckle woven through for sweetness. Somebody in the community always had roses along a fence line, and they were always offered freely for a wedding. The bouquet was assembled the morning of, still damp with dew, tied with ribbon saved from a Christmas package. It was alive in a way a florist's arrangement is not. It would wilt by evening, and that was fine. That was the point. It was real. Number 10. The church was decorated entirely by the women of the congregation. No hired decorator, no rented arch. The women showed up early in the morning, and I mean early before sunrise, with flowers from their own gardens and greenery cut from the fields and whatever candles the church owned and whatever ribbon could be found, and they transformed that wooden interior into something that bore no resemblance to its ordinary weekday self. It became a different place. Sacred in a way it wasn't even on a regular Sunday, and the women who did that work, who climbed on pews and tied things to rafters and argued quietly about where to put what, those women are the unsung architects of every beautiful thing their community ever created. Now, before we keep going, family, I need to stop right here and ask you something, because we're talking about weddings, and I want to hear from you. Did anybody in your family practice any of these traditions? Your grandmother, your great-aunt, somebody who got married back in those years. Or maybe there is a tradition I haven't mentioned yet that you remember. Drop it in the comments. Tell me the story. Tell me her name. Because these women deserve to have their names said out loud, and this community you are part of right now is the right place to say them. Drop it in the comments, family. I read every single one. Number 11. Now we are getting into the ceremony itself, and I want to talk about something that most people today have never heard of. In many black communities across the South in the early decades of the 20th century, the wedding ceremony did not begin with the bride walking down an aisle. It began with the whole congregation singing, not a prelude played on an organ, singing. A hymn that the whole room knew, voices unaccompanied or with just a piano if the church had one, all of them lifting the couple into the ceremony on the sound of their voices. Blessed assurance. His eye is on the sparrow. Take my hand, precious Lord. The choice of song was deliberate. It was chosen by the family or the pastor to say something specific about this particular union, about what this couple was going to need on the road ahead. The music was a prayer before the prayer. Number 12. The ring ceremony had a specific vocabulary that most young people today have never heard. When the pastor said those words, "With this ring I thee wed," the man was not just repeating a phrase. He was making a covenant in the presence of God and witness, and the congregation responded, not silently. They said amen, audibly, collectively. The room participated in the moment of the covenant, and that participation was its authentication. The community witnessed it. The community consecrated it. That amen was the seal, and without it, something felt incomplete. Number 13. The broom. Now this is the tradition most people have at least heard of, but very few know the full weight of it. Jumping the broom goes back to slavery, when enslaved people were not permitted to legally marry. To declare a union, couples jumped over a broom together, and the community recognized the marriage even when the law would not. By the Jim Crow era, many churches had moved away from it as they built more formal institutions. But in the rural communities, in the Deep South, along the Georgia Sea Islands and through Mississippi and Alabama, it persisted. And what it meant had deepened. It was not superstition. It was memory. It was the community saying, "We remember what it took to get to the point where we can do this at all. We remember who couldn't." The broom was laid on the threshold, and the couple jumped it together, and the people who watched knew exactly what they were watching. Number 14. The wedding feast was not catered. Let me say that again for the people in the back. It was not catered. Every woman in the congregation and the neighborhood brought food. Every one. There was no coordination form. There was no spreadsheet. Somebody just knew who was bringing the fried chicken, because she always brought the fried chicken, and somebody else knew she was bringing the potato salad, and the deacon's wife was bringing the pound cakes, because she had been bringing the pound cakes to every occasion at that church since before most of the young people present had been born. It was organized by the unspoken logic of a community that had fed itself together for generations. And the table, oh family, the table. It stretched the length of the fellowship hall, and then some, covered end to end with everything beautiful that those women knew how to make, and it was given freely. because love was expressed in this community through food the way other communities express it through words. Number 15. The wedding cake was not from a bakery. It was made in somebody's kitchen. In most cases, the mother of the bride made it herself, or the woman in the church who was known for her cakes. A white layer cake most often, or a pound cake depending on the region. The frosting was made from scratch with real butter and real sugar, sometimes flavored with vanilla extract or lemon. And the decoration was done by hand, a steady hand with a butter knife, or sometimes a woman who could work a paper cone filled with icing into flowers and scroll work that would have embarrassed a professional. That cake was a labor of love in the most literal sense. You could taste it. Number 16. The wedding colors were not chosen from a sample book at a bridal shop. They were chosen by the women of the family based on what was accessible and what was meaningful. White and yellow were common across the South. Blue and white for families with a particular biblical devotion. Blue for heaven, white for purity. In the Sea Island communities off the coasts of Georgia and South Carolina, brides sometimes carried or wore blue beads from the African tradition, glass trade beads that had traveled a long and terrible route to reach that moment, worn now as adornment, as ancestral connection, as a thread pulled taut across generations and oceans. The color you chose meant something. It was not a trend, it was a statement. Number 17. The money dance. After the meal, after the cake, when the music started in earnest, and the music was a piano, or a guitar, or a fiddle, if the community leaned that way, or sometimes just a man with a good singing voice and a sense of rhythm, the money dance began. Guests pinned dollar bills and coins to the bride's dress as they danced with her, not as a game, as a gift, as a practical act of community care for a couple who was starting with nothing but each other. Every pin was somebody saying, "You will not start empty-handed. We are behind you." In some families, the groom had his own version, jacket lapels pinned with bills by the women who wished to dance with him. The couple would finish the evening covered in the generosity of their people, and that money would buy the first real piece of furniture, or cover the first month's rent, or start the savings account that nobody in that family had ever had before. Number 18. The chivalry. Now this one surprises people. On the wedding night, once the couple had retired, and the whole community knew where they were going, a group of the young men and older boys would gather outside the window. They brought pots and pans. They brought drums if they had them. They made noise, a tremendous, celebratory, completely uninvited noise right outside that window until the groom came out and distributed candy or coins or something sweet to the crowd to make them go away. It sounds like a prank, and it was partly a prank, but it was also the community claiming the right to participate even in the privacy of the wedding night. It was joy expressed as racket. It was the young men of the neighborhood saying, "We see you, we celebrate you, now pay the toll." That tradition is gone, and I understand why. But there was something real in it, the joy of it, the sound of it out there in the southern dark. Number 19. The morning after the wedding, the bride's mother brought breakfast, not delivered from a restaurant. Made in her own kitchen the night before and carried over at first light. Biscuits wrapped in cloth to keep them warm. Preserved fig or pear jam she had put up in August. A piece of cured ham. Strong coffee in a jar. She knocked on the door early. Not too early, but early. And she left the food, and she went away again without requiring anything. It was a bridge. It was the mother saying, "You are married now, but you are not alone. I am still here. I will always be here." The breakfast was an act of such practical tenderness that I have never been able to talk about it without feeling it in my chest. Number 20. For much of the Jim Crow era, when black couples traveled away from their home community, even if only to visit relatives in another town, they carried what was called the Green Book. The Negro Motorist Green Book, published from 1936 through 1966, listed the hotels, boarding houses, restaurants, and beauty parlors that would serve black travelers. A newly married couple embarking on anything resembling a honeymoon did not simply get in a car and drive. They planned carefully. They knew which roads were safe after dark and which were not. They carried the green book and they consulted it. The honeymoon itself was often not a destination. It was a visit to relatives in another state who had more space, who would receive the couple with celebration, who could offer a guest room and a good table. It was not the honeymoon the magazines advertised. It was better in many ways. It was surrounded by love. Number 21. The return. When the couple came back from wherever they had gone, even if they had only been gone 2 days, the neighborhood received them. Neighbors came by with more food. The front porch was where it happened, people dropping by casually, as if by accident, to bring a jar of something, to shake the man's hand, to hug the woman. And they were given the couple's new title by the community in those greetings. She was no longer a girl's name. She was Mrs., and not just Mrs. Smith. She was addressed with the full formal title, out loud, by neighbors and church members, for the first time on that return. The name change was not just legal. It was communal. It was practiced out loud. The community gave it to her. Number 22. The Bible. Every couple received a Bible. Sometimes from the church, sometimes from the pastor personally, sometimes from a grandparent who had carried that particular Bible since before the turn of the century. And the couple's names were written in it. Their names, the date of the wedding, and in the margins, in the handwriting of whoever gave it, a scripture chosen specifically for them. Not a generic verse. A word selected with care for this particular man and this particular woman and what the giver of the Bible believed they would need. That Bible went on the mantle or on the nightstand, and it recorded from that day forward every birth and every death in the family that came after. The family Bible was the original family record. In a community that was not always permitted to exist in public records with dignity, the family Bible was the ledger that said, "We were here. These are our names. This is when we were born, and when we loved, and when we were called home." Number 23. In the Gullah Geechee communities of coastal South Carolina and Georgia, there existed a wedding tradition so old its origins are disputed among historians, but its roots are clearly African. On the morning of the wedding, the bride's female relatives would wash her feet, literally wash them, in a basin, with water scented with herbs or flower petals gathered from the yard. It was a purification rite and a tenderness rite, both at once. It echoed the biblical washing of feet, that ultimate act of humble love, but it also echoed something older, something that came across the water. The women who did it did not necessarily know all of its origins. They knew it was what you did. They knew it mattered, and the bride who received it sat quietly in that early morning stillness, while the hands of her people moved over her feet. And she understood, even if she could not have articulated it, that she was being sent into her marriage held up by something very old and very strong. Number 24, the second line. In the communities with connections to New Orleans and the Gulf Coast tradition, after the ceremony, the wedding party and the guests formed a second-line procession. Led by a brass band or by singing, they walked through the neighborhood. Not quietly. They danced. They waved handkerchiefs. They filled the street. They took the joy of that ceremony out of the church and into the world where everyone could see it, where the neighbors who weren't invited could stand on their porches and wave and call out and be part of it. The second line was the community's refusal to contain joy indoors. It was joy made public and mobile and loud. It was the community saying to anyone watching, "Look at us. Look at what we have. Look at what they cannot take from us." That second line went through streets where black people had been told to be invisible for 100 years, and it was the most visible thing in the world. Number 25. The grandmothers. I have to stop here and give the grandmothers a moment, family, because no account of a black wedding in the Jim Crow South is complete without them. They were the center of gravity at every one of these occasions. They sat in the front pew. They wore hats that had been wrapped in tissue paper since the last occasion and were brought out now with ceremony. They did not smile immediately at the beginning of the ceremony. Their expression was too serious for that, too weighted with everything they knew. But when the vows were said, when the couple turned to face the congregation, you could see it cross those old faces. Not just joy, relief. The kind of relief that only comes from having worried deeply about something for a long time and having it finally, mercifully, go right. Those women had seen things. They had survived things. And every young couple standing at that altar was proof that everything they had survived had been worth it. Number 26. The handkerchief. In many families, the bride carried a handkerchief that had belonged to her grandmother or great-grandmother on her wedding day. Not a new handkerchief, an old one, edged with lace that had yellowed and softened with age, or embroidered in the corner with initials that were not the bride's own. She held it throughout the ceremony, and if she cried, and she usually cried, she used it. And afterward it was folded and put away again for the next generation. Some of those handkerchiefs passed through 4 or 5 weddings. The thread in them was thinning by then. The white had long since turned to cream, and the women who carried them did so with a reverence that had nothing to do with the object itself, and everything to do with what the object had witnessed. It had been held by shaking hands. By hands now gone, it carried that. The bride felt it. Number 27. The prayer before the ceremony, before the processional began, before the guests settled in their pews, before the music started. There was a room somewhere in that church building where the couple knelt together, with the pastor if he was the type, or alone if they preferred, but they knelt together and they prayed. Not the ceremony prayer, a private one. Just the two of them, in some small side room or the pastor's study, on their knees on whatever floor was under them, asking God for what they knew they were going to need. Because they were not naive. They had watched their parents' marriages. They had watched their grandparents' marriages. They had seen what it took to stay together through hard seasons, through crop failures and job losses, and children dying and houses flooding and all the ordinary and extraordinary sorrows that a life together accumulates. And they were asking, genuinely asking, before the day began, for the strength to do it. That prayer was not performative. It was terrified and necessary and real. Number 28. The wedding shoes. Now, Big Mama, she used to say that you could tell everything about a woman by her shoes on her wedding day. Not because of what they looked like, because of where they came from. In these communities, the wedding shoes were often borrowed. Not because the family couldn't eventually acquire a pair, but because there was a tradition of wearing the shoes of a woman whose marriage you wanted to emulate. A woman whose marriage had been long and strong and full of the right things. Her shoes were borrowed by the brides who came after her. You wore the shoes of a woman who had made it, and what that meant to a young woman standing at the door of her own marriage, feeling the leather that had stood in 30 years of kitchen floors and church aisles and front porches. Family, what that meant is something you have to be willing to be humble enough to feel. Number 29. The naming of the dead. At some point in many of these ceremonies, sometimes at the beginning, sometimes in the middle, depending on the pastor and the family, the names of the dead were spoken aloud. Those who could not be present, parents gone, grandparents gone, children gone before their time, sometimes a first husband or wife taken too early. The pastor called their names, and the congregation said amen after each one, and the names floated up into the rafters of that little church and became part of the ceremony, part of the air in the room, part of the witness. The dead attended. They were invited, and they came. And the couple being married understood, in the deepest possible way, that they were not starting fresh. They were continuing something. They were adding a chapter to a book that had been written by people who loved them and were waiting for them somewhere beyond where any of us can see. Number 30. The last tradition, the final one. The one I want you to carry with you when you leave here today. After the ceremony, after the feast, after the dancing and the money pinned to the dress and the cake and the noise of the chivalry fading away in the night. After all of it. There was a moment, and this happened in household after household, generation after generation, in ways so consistent it cannot be accidental, when the oldest woman in the family found the new bride. Not a crowd moment, a private one. She found her in a doorway, or on the edge of the porch, or in the kitchen washing a cup that didn't need washing, and she took her by both hands. And she looked at her. Just looked at her. For a long time. With eyes that had seen 70 or 80 years of what this life does to a woman, and what a woman can do back to this life. And then she said something. Every family has a different version of what she said. Some of them have been written down, most of them haven't. But the shape of what was said is always the same. She named what was ahead. She named what was hard. She did not lie, and she did not soften it. And then she said, "You can do it. I know you can do it, because I know who you come from." That was the last tradition. Not the preacher's benediction, not the throwing of the rice, not the car driving away into the night with cans tied to the bumper. This woman's hands, this woman's eyes, this transmission of strength from someone who had it to someone who was going to need it. That was how it was done, family. That was how love was built to last in the Jim Crow South. Not because the conditions were easy, because the community refused to let anyone face them alone. These 30 traditions are what they left us, and now you know them again. I'll see you next time, family.